I do think sometimes there's a bit of a relevance trap where everyone is doing relevance. So all you're doing is showing the audience's world. Here you are, here you are, here you are, here you are. As opposed to resonance, which is actually about thinking of ways of creating interest, entertainment, amusement, engagement with the audience through feeling. So I think, our industry have been speaking about relevance until we blue in the face. That can be a bit of a trap because that's why everything starts looking the same, because you're doing relevance as opposed to making sure you've also got resonance.
I'm Eric Fulweiler, and this is Scratch, bringing you marketing lessons from the leading brands and brains rewriting the rulebook from scratch for the world of today. Hey everyone, my conversation today is with Diana Springer. She is the group head of brand and marketing at Standard Bank, one of the biggest brands in Africa and the biggest financial services brand in Africa, working across 20 African countries with millions of customers. Fascinating conversation with Diana. She is relatively new to this role at Standard Bank. She's about 18 months in, and before that, she spent many years at many of South Africa's most prestigious agencies. She was the Chief Data and Intelligence Officer at M&C Saatchi Group, South Africa. Before that, she was at a different division of M&C Saatchi. She was also at Ogilvy. So she brings a ton of experience in South Africa, regionally on the African continent, and globally to bear on this role. Some of the things that we talked about that I loved, and I'm certainly going to be thinking about and mulling over the next couple weeks, we talk a lot about this term challenger brand and what it means coming into one of the biggest brands in the category at Standard Bank, and how she's kind of pulling some of the advantages of what a challenger can do, particularly when it comes to storytelling and this idea of what she calls biblical storytelling that challengers can do, but also leveraging the advantages of being an incumbent, particularly scale and trust. We also talk about her definition of relevance versus resonance, which I thought was really interesting and actually haven't heard too much about. The role of creativity and how she sustains it within the organization. Coming into a role like this, particularly being new to the client and the corporate side, a lot of how she's been effective and will be effective is how she's working with the stakeholders around her, which she talks about. And then lastly, a topic that is near and dear to my heart, hardworking marketing. And we talk about how sometimes you just need work that works. Sustainable, effective marketing work. It does not need to be that complicated. So without further ado, please enjoy my conversation with Diana Springer of Standard Bank. Diana, welcome to the show. Thank you so much for making the time. How are things in Johannesburg today?
Hi, Eric. Thank you for having me. Johannesburg is beautiful today. Very hot, blue skies, good African summer's day.
Amazing. Well, I'll be back down there in January, and actually we're going to be hosting one of our rival CMO roundtables. So of course, would love to have you at that. I'll send along the date after the recording, but can't wait to get back. So much going on in South Africa these days. So, Diana, really excited to have the conversation about Standard Bank and what you've been doing since you've joined. But before we get into that, the icebreaker question that we ask every guest, can you tell us about a challenger brand you're particularly passionate about right now and why?
Thanks, Eric. I've been thinking about this a lot. It's not one that I find very easy to answer at the moment. Many of the big challenges are competitors to Standard Bank in the fintech space. I'm not going to give them airtime. Um, and it feels like a strange brand because it's not a new brand, but I've always loved Spotify as a challenger attitude in category. I suppose it might qualify as a challenger brand in terms of how it's challenged the industry. And I think they certainly, from an advertising point of view, have just been outstanding and consistent. And I've been really impressed how they've managed to do a similar thing, even in a market like South Africa, as a global brand, still show up with that same tone and manner and attitude. And they've broken into this market excellently, brilliantly. We've actually currently running a partnership with them for our youth market. So they kind of stuck out for me. Other than that, in South Africa, as South African brands, I probably have to go into categories like health and beauty, where there've been some phenomenal brands that have opened in the kind of slightly more niche design, fashion space. Lots of young African and South African designers who are now, starting to run quite compelling and powerful brands like Tsepo Jeans, open at Sandton City, amazing young designer. The skincare brand called Skoon, which means clean in Afrikaans, also beautiful. So there's lots of that arty, creative a challenger in South Africa. But yeah, those were what came to mind. Not maybe a typical answer, but certainly the ones that I enjoy and consume. The last one I thought of was Whoop. I don't know if you're familiar with Whoop. I've been wearing
Of
Whoops,
course.
so you can see my Whoop. Again, it's a challenger, I suppose, and a really interesting one, how it's caught on to the post-COVID sentiment zeitgeist around well-being and health. And we're seeing quite a lot now, even in South Africa, where people are starting to really kind of engage with those types of utility-based, I suppose, brands. So yeah.
Yeah, Whoop is a great example and one of our favorite challenger brands. So if you happen to know anybody over there, we're definitely looking to get them on the podcast. The other one that we're trying to line up an interview for next week is Aura Ring. Has Aura Ring become a big thing in South Africa
It
yet?
it has, I
Similar
suppose
kind
it's.
of functionality, but it's a ring instead of the wrap.
I have seen a few, and I've seen a
Yeah.
few people wearing them. I haven't seen much marketing activity from Aura, but I've certainly, the trend is there. And South Africa and South Africans definitely outdoorsy, health and wellness driven, but also I think well-being and mental well-being is becoming a very, very hot topic. Actually, for us in the organization, my Whoop is actually an organizational wide drive. So this is a project within the organization. Interestingly, yeah.
Interesting.
Hmm.
I know I'm going off script here, so we don't have to touch on this, but I'd just be curious. You mentioned kind of the fintech challengers that you don't want to give airtime to. There was a question that came up in our CMO WhatsApp group, AMP, which I'll have to add you to after this, recently, that was, hey, what do you think the CMOs of incumbent banks, like what's on the top of their kind of worry list or priority list? And a couple of people said, well, I'm sure they're thinking about the challenger banks and how they're taking mind share, et cetera. I had a bit of a different opinion. I kind of go back to the fundamentals of how you deal with the board, how you quantify the commercial results that you're delivering, your own role within the organization, and let's be honest, kind of the politics that go along with that. So I was like, I just don't think that that's at the top of the list, but I'd be curious, effectively CMO of a big incumbent bank, where does thinking about or watching what the challengers in your space are doing, where does that rank in your kind of priorities or your mind share?
It's a really interesting question, and it's one that I probably need to answer in two different ways. Do the current fintech challenges, are they the thing that keeps me awake at night? And probably not. I would almost see them more as potential partner opportunities, as opening up new opportunities and territories. Certainly, when you look across the African continent, the role that fintech can play in creating accessibility of banking for those markets is one that we, as a big brand, would seek to almost partner on. We do recognize the need, as do a lot of financial services institutions, to start serving needs beyond the typical banking needs. And so we definitely see an ecosystem play as being a really, really important one. So my first answer would be no. My second answer would be yes, because it wasn't long ago that a small challenger in South Africa, Capitec, was founded. And where maybe didn't think it was going to change our industry. And they now have more retail clients in South Africa than we do. So whilst they're not a typical challenger in terms of that their proposition is relatively traditional, they certainly managed to come and disrupt a very mature market at that time. So I think it would be naive as a CMO not to always keep an eye on new challenger, interesting propositions. And they challenge through attitude and through positioning rather than necessarily through product. So can I answer no and yes? Yeah.
You can. That's fascinating. And just to kind of get the context, so I appreciate you letting me go off script, but let's get back on script. So for those who might not know, can you please give an overview of Standard Bank, what it does, the footprint that you have, just
Absolutely.
kind of a quick summary of the business and brand as it stands right now?
Certainly. So the Standard Bank Group is the biggest financial services institution in Africa. We have a very broad proposition. We service all the way through from our retail clients, so our consumer audience. We have a business and commercial division. We have a corporate investment banking division, CIB, and we also have an insurance and asset management proposition. So really all things financial services, from your entry-level banking products, emerging markets, currently unbanked, becoming banked, all the way through to the very most sophisticated deal making in our CIB corporate and investment banking environment. We operate in 22 markets, 20 on the continent and 2 offshore hubs. And we have offices in 26 countries. So that includes the States and the UK, etc. We have 15 million retail clients, roundabout. It's hard to say, active clients. Whether it be insurance, whether it be transactional banking, lending, saving, investments, we do it all. We have many sub-brands under our stable as well. So not only the Standard Bank Group and the very well-known Standard Bank brand, but we also have a very big brand called Liberty in our stable, as well as many other actually fintech and typically challenger brands that we partner with or that we have ownership structures around.
So I'd be curious to hear you expand on kind of the term, the dichotomy, challenger, incumbent, because I know in our prep call, when I gave you the overview of Rival and what we're all about with this podcast and all the research and content and events that we do, it's about understanding what challengers are doing differently to drive growth in categories that are being disrupted. And you had an interesting take because, similar to how you answered yes and no to the, are you looking at what the challengers are doing? You kind of answered yes and no to, is Standard Bank a challenger? And some of that was certainly by market. In certain markets, you're more of a challenger. In certain markets, you're more of an incumbent. But part of it to me also seemed like maybe a dichotomy in your perspective on the topic and trying to pull the advantages from a challenger playbook and also an incumbent playbook. So I'd love to just let you elaborate on that. Like, what does the term challenger mean to you and for Standard Bank right now?
Yeah, thanks. And I think it was a really interesting question because when we spoke, I had just been in the States and had been chatting to a number of the politicos in that environment around the elections, which are now this week. So there's the timing. We were talking about the challenger brand of Trump versus the incumbent brand, and those at that time of Biden, actually. So that's where we were in the election, and we were speaking a lot about how incumbents take with them almost the category failure. So you get the failure baked in of the category, and then the challenger is able to come and challenge the category. So in banking, challenge speed of service or challenge complexity. So you kind of, as the incumbent or as a very large brand, you take that on. I suppose for Standard Bank, we are 162 years old. So we certainly would see ourselves as an incumbent, certainly in some instances a heritage brand. But as I reflected then, and as you've alluded to, in many of the markets in which we now operate, we are not considered the incumbent. We are actually more a smaller brand. I wouldn't say we necessarily have a challenger spirit, but we are a smaller brand. And I suppose what's interesting in financial services is that trust is your seat at the stake at the table. Trust is you have to be trusted to be able to operate in financial services. You absolutely you're dealing with money, the fundamental survival of businesses and clients that you bank. So it's an interesting one to say, challenges typically come with a degree of irreverence, which we would never have, regardless of whether we're leader or smaller in those markets. But certainly what we do have the opportunity to do is to consider how do we challenge some of the expectations or some of the baked in failure of our category just in our products and services. So yeah, I would like to, I wouldn't say that Standard Bank is a challenger brand, but there are some instances where we are able to challenge convention. So for instance, in insurance, we've got some very challenging products because banking brands, are new to an insurance game. So in that instance, we can, through a proposition or through a service promise, challenge some of what is known of the category. However, our brand still remains one of trust, one of stability, one of reliability, one of relatability, as opposed to an attitude, that kind of irreverence that typically a challenger brand might have. I hope that answers your question somewhat. So yeah, I suppose what worries me is that we don't want to take the category failure as our positioning, but equally, So we can challenge some of the category, but I wouldn't say we challenge in that kind of typical brand irreverence type of way that challenger brands do.
Hey everyone, just another quick interruption. If you're listening to this podcast and you're not already part of our AMP community on WhatsApp, would love for you to get involved. So AMP is a community that we started at the beginning of the business, really, just to kind of bring together some of the interesting people that we were talking to, the marketers that we were coming across, many of whom have been on this show as well. And so now AMP is about 300 senior marketers from around the world, from various categories, different stages, challengers, incumbents. And it's really a place where people can share questions, can share resources, can make new connections, can use folks as sounding boards. And for those that are in it, you know, it is a very vibrant community. It's really taken on a life of its own, which is amazing. So if you're listening to this and you want to get involved, please go to our website, wearerival.com. There you can find the application form or reach out to me or someone at Rival directly. Thanks so much.
So I know I'm skipping around here, so bear with me, but I want to follow the flow of the conversation. I think this is a really interesting topic to double click on, even though technically it was supposed to be in chapter 3 of the brief. So you come from, and we'll talk more about this, more of an agency background. You worked at creative agencies, Ogilvy, Saatchi, et cetera. So clearly, or at least it seems to me, and even in the quick answer you gave there, that brand is very centric to how you think about the job to be done for you at Standard Bank, and marketing and the role of marketing overall to drive growth of the business. And one of the things that I loved in our prep call that you talked about, and you just elaborated on a little bit there, failure being baked in for the incumbents, but also challengers being able to tell a story in a heroic way. And I think you even used the term biblical storytelling
I did.
around
Biblical
challengers. You know, the David
storytelling.
Goliath metaphor that
Mm.
everybody uses, of course, and needing to stand against something. Or I should say, being able to stand against something as an easy way to drive differentiation, I would say,
Yes.
and
Yes.
relevance within a category.
Yes,
So,
it's exactly what I said.
d-
Biblical storytelling
yeah,
for the challenger, which is the formula of victim, uh, hero, you know, problem solution. So it's pretty much how those stories are
yeah.
told. You're going to have the victim, they've got the challenge, and you're going to have your hero that solves. And that's what challenges tend to do, is that storytelling around, creating the maybe it's the audience in some instances is the victim. And then they come in and become the hero, position themselves to solve against the incumbent that might be the villain,
Yeah.
So victim villain. So yeah, I do think that's how I've viewed the opportunity for challenger, and I suppose that starts to say, how do we defend against that, as arguably who they might paint as the villain in those situations, the
I
Goliath.
I think I
Mm.
think it is really interesting to kind of boil it down to the basics, the fundamentals. Not necessarily of marketing, if you leave that to the side for a second, but just of storytelling, right? Because my definition of marketing is, how do you tell a story that changes perception and behavior in order to drive growth of a business? It's a story at the end of the day. And it's interesting, I'm thinking about, we had the prep call, but have not yet done the recording for the new CMO of Oddbox, which is kind of like a, food and veg delivery startup here in the UK. And he comes from a creative writing background. And so he takes the approach of, like, if I'm the Ernest Hemingway telling the story of this brand, how would I break it down? Because there are certain factors in the equation. There are certain hooks, certain tips and tricks of creative storytelling that get the human brain engaged in a way. And I think that idea of heroic, biblical, who's the hero, who's the villain, I think that makes sense. And so it sounds like, I guess my question is, how, to the extent you can share, how are you taking that insight on challenger versus incumbent when it comes to brand storytelling? How are you applying that to Standard Bank now, 18 months into your role?
Um, I've spent a lot of this last year, so a year and a half I've been in the role. I spent a lot of time thinking about what is the story of the Standard Bank brand. And I think the wonderful thing about having the heritage and the legacy that we do have is that we do have quite an amazing story to tell. Um, the other thing I've been thinking about a lot is the category that we exist in. And I was talking to a very clever creative on Friday who was saying this category, you see a lot of the category, you don't feel a lot of the category. And so I suppose these two ideas of storytelling and emotion go hand in hand really well, because I suppose the reason that we remember stories fairy tales and stories, is that they made us feel something. And maybe that's what this victim, villain, hero thing does, is it kind of appeals to us on that slightly more human level or emotional level.
For
So I
sure.
suppose what I've been thinking is what is the story we tell, and how do we do that in an emotive way, so that it's not just a functional story of products and services and all the fabulous things that we are famous for, because amazing stuff that we do. But how do we do that in a truly human and relatable and emotive way? I've also been doing, and I think you did speak about this before, is really working very hard with the organization on knowing our truth. Um, Again, I was chatting to the chief creative officer of Wyden Kennedy a while ago, and he was saying that sometimes they feel like therapists when they work with big brands, big incumbent brands, because they have to get them to be comfortable to be themselves, so desperately trying not to be themselves. You almost kind of fall a little bit out of love with who you are because of all of this challenge and newness around you. And you go, they look more exciting or more sexy than we are. How do I be more like them? No, actually, you have to be yourself. So I suppose the starting point has been working really hard on our truth and understanding it, understanding the story of the brand, but then finally making sure that we can tell that in a way that is emotive and relevant. Sorry to use that annoying word, but that is resonant, I should probably say, for our audiences. Um, so, so I suppose that's been kind of our approach: is what is our truth? What is our story and our perspective that we want to take to market? And how do we do that in a resonant and truly emotive way? Because our category is all functional at the moment. And even our challenges are challenging quite functionally. So how do we make sure that we create something a little bit more of a feeling, a little bit more emotive? Maybe that'll be our challenge. So that's what I want to do. That's what I intend to.
Yeah.
Maybe easier said than done. We're also doing a lot of work internally to tell our story. So, just really, this business has got a lot of pride. People love Standard Bank, working here. It's a brilliant place to work. So it's just about unlocking that, letting that advocacy kind of spill over and telling that story internally, so people can mythologize almost, the story of the brand. Yeah.
Hey everyone, just a quick interruption to share a really exciting announcement about some new research that we have put out about the rise of microcultures. So as you know, we at Rival are all about understanding what are challenger brands doing differently to grow within categories that are being disrupted. And one of the biggest trends that we've seen over the last few years, and this comes straight from the brain of our Chief Strategy Officer, Lance Koenig, is that challenger brands are mapping and tapping into microcultures to drive relevance and talkability and ultimately growth. They have flipped the playbook, the incumbent playbook of top-down macroculture, on its head, and they're doing really exciting and differentiated things. So if you want to learn more about it, there's a landing page on our website. There's going to be a link in the show notes here. Go read the report, listen to the limited edition podcast series that we put out with it as well. I think you're going to find it fascinating and really valuable. Let me know what you think.
And I'll throw it out there because maybe you're too humble to, but it sounds like that work on the internal comms is paying off, as you were ranked 18 on a list of top 20 of the world's best employers by Forbes recently. So congratulations on that front.
Thank you.
Just to go back to the resonant versus relevant conversation, I thought that was really interesting. The kind of challenger playbook of what we've identified these challenger brands do differently. It starts with differentiation, but then it goes into relevance. How do you actually get people to care about who you are by connecting with things that they care about? Let's start with the definition. How do you think about the difference between resonance and relevance? And then what does that mean for you and how you're approaching storytelling and marcoms as a brand?
Okay. I would define it as follows. I think I might be right, but this is how I kind of see it. Resonance for me is far more about the emotion and the feeling. So I said striking a chord is, I suppose, exactly what resonance actually does mean in a scientific way. So it's a resonant is the emotional connectedness and the feeling that you evoke. Relevance is about closeness to context. So I see actually in my world, I see the master brand and things that we do around, say, for instance, sponsorship. It's having a massive job to do when it comes to resonance. And I see our business units or our products and services brands really needing to deliver relevance because they are in the customer context, close to the audience. Having said that, and again, this this is just my opinion. I do think sometimes there's a bit of a relevance trap where everyone is doing relevance. So all you're doing is showing the audience's world. Here you are, here you are, here you are, here you are. As opposed to resonance, which is actually about thinking of ways of creating interest, entertainment, amusement, engagement with the audience through feeling. So I think, our industry have been speaking about relevance until we blue in the face. I think sometimes that can be a bit of a trap because that's why everything starts looking the same, because you're doing relevance as opposed to making sure you've also got resonance. Maybe over intellectualized, but my mother was an English teacher, so there you go.
So matters. Yeah, I can see that being drilled at the family dinner
Mm.
table. So I'd be curious, like if we bring it down to like the day-to-day tactical level, what does that look like? Like, are you writing briefs or are you kind of guiding your agencies to say, hey, I want this to be more resonant, or actually this campaign just needs to be relevant? And did you have to kind of like, you know, um, help to educate your internal teams to shift their perspective? Because it makes total sense as you think about it. It's not a conversation that I've come across that often. So I can imagine it is something where if you want different output from your internal or your external teams around that topic, you might have to kind of lead them or guide them in a different way.
Mm. I would love to say I've solved it. I don't think I have completely. I think what's worth reflecting on is I work in a matrixed model. So while I sit in group brand and marketing, I have a executive that I'm on who are then responsible for business unit marketing within certain segments. That makes sense. So you've got marketing for corporate and investment banking, marketing for personal and private banking, and we all work together in the executive. So I suppose in that matrix model, I have been thinking about the frameworks, I suppose, or maybe the briefs around making sure we all understand the jobs that we need to do to all ultimately build equity or value for the Standard Bank Group brand. Um, I do have the benefit in my role of being able to do the brand advertising. So I suppose that gives me the clarity of what I'm seeking to do in that space. And certainly my agenda in that space is very much around the emotive value of the brand, because I'm to some extent liberated from having to do the product proof or service solution proof points. However, working very closely within the business units and my partners in those marketing teams to make sure that at least that from a positioning point of view, we are all stacking up as one story. But yeah, I think that's the challenge, isn't it? That's the ongoing challenge to say, when are the moments where you really want to work hard with your creative partners and make sure that those are moments that you really elevate and it creates that salience, that moment, as opposed to every single brief becoming this massive creative challenge, because we would never get anything in market. And, we've got a massive retail business. We've got a lot of work being published every day. So I don't think we've got that quite right. I think that's part of our ongoing balancing act, I suppose, um, to make sure that you are kind of with your partners are putting the energy into the right places.
And the people side of this is, of course, half, or in my opinion, more than half the equation, particularly when you're operating at the scale that you are with one of the biggest brands in the world, one of the biggest businesses in Africa. So let's talk about that for a second. The Matrix organization, I know there were some changes to the structure around
Uh-huh.
marketing internally before you came in. And then, as always, for every CMO, the managing up, the communicating up, often the education around here's why this matters and why we need to do it differently is such a key
Yes.
part of the role. So I'd love to hear you talk a little bit about, and also I'll just note, you coming in from spending a lot of time in the agency world, of course, working with big businesses like this, but not being on the inside. How has that been, and how have you approached the work around the work, as I call it, of stakeholder management, getting people clear and aligned, and maybe some education around what you want to do with the brand and some of these topics that we've talked about so far?
Yeah. Um, Gosh, there's lots of questions in that question. So, um, the the work around the work, I'm doing a lot of work with our teams, and I suppose just trying to role model how to engage with creativity. My current mantra is focus on what's strong, not on what's wrong. Um, and because that's how I think ideas come alive, I think that there's often a nugget, and you kind of focus on all the things that might not meet our compliance frameworks or, governance structures. But if you focus on what's strong, not on what's wrong, you can together um, create the moments of creative magic. A lot of work to really elevate the power of creativity within financial services as an organization. So I'm doing kind of a lot of evangelical work, I suppose, with teams, with stakeholders, um, forums and conferences. Just more time really to appreciate the power of creativity has become a bit of one of the things I've been speaking a lot about. And I suppose it's probably to some extent why I was appointed into the role, is the desire to create that creative force a little bit more in the organization. So that's the first thing. The second is just to speak a little bit about how we've restructured when I joined. What the decision that was made at the time, and I think it's absolutely paying off, is to create, rather than a singular CMO structure, to create some focused domains. So we have a brand and marketing domain discipline, we have an eventing and experience discipline, and we have a reputation and communication discipline. The three of us work incredibly closely together, but we are able to have kind of very focused practitioners in our teams who are able to specialize in those domains and who then pull them through the organization as centers of excellence. So that's been a really interesting model, and that's working well. But what holds us all together is we have the shared goal, ultimately the shared measure of brand value, don't we all? But also the shared goal of really using creativity as our tool to achieve that. Because, as I've said, we've got many of the functional proofs. It's about building that more emotive layer. In terms of the probably the third part of your question was about the managing up and the stake, why what we do is important. Yeah, that's been interesting. I think we're lucky that marketing science has become that much more proven and prevalent, and that there's some fantastic resources now to lean on to actually evidence the impact of what we do, whether it be the IPA or Ehrenberg Bass or very many of the leaders in those fields. So I certainly am trying as far as possible, and I'm constantly challenged to add more data to our stories. And by that, I don't mean measurement data. I mean kind of the science of marketing, the why is it important to do brand building, the how do you do these things, what the right kind of proportions of investment are. So really, I'm trying hard to be able to talk in the right language to the senior stakeholders. It's, again, I would say that's a work in progress. And I think sometimes it's a little bit build it and they will come. You go and do that amazing campaign, everyone goes, oh, she was clever. but it's to get to that maybe is my next challenge. So I hope that answers the three different questions: the CMO structure, stakeholder management, and then really creativity is, I just keep on holding it up, as something that we need. And then there's that brilliant case study from Cannes this year. I don't know who the speaker was, where he spoke about a cow eating grass getting more attention than most of advertising. I mean, that's startling, but it's that kind of evidence that you go.
Hey everyone, just want to take a quick minute because we've actually heard from many of you that you want to get a better understanding of what it is that we actually do here at Rival. You know us for the content. Obviously, you're listening to Scratch right now, but everything else that we put out, the events, the community, but actually our core business, just so you know, we are a marketing consultancy for challenger brands. We partner with brands big and small to gain category share with a challenger approach. We develop and execute strategies and campaigns across 4 main areas of the marketing function: brand strategy, creative and production, paid media planning and buying, and customer data and MarTech. And then, of course, as you know, the mission that's wrapped around Rival is to understand and share our learnings about what drives the growth of successful challenger brands. That's it. Sorry for the interruption. I'll let you get back to the show.
We've got to do something a bit differently to grab attention from our audiences.
Yeah, I mean, for sure, that's what we see with these challengers, is that differentiate, there's a reason it's at the core of the model. And you can't be different just for the sake of being different. Like if a cow eating grass has nothing to do with your brand and how you're challenging the category convention, then it's a bit wasted. But, it's like that saying of the biggest risk is being ignored, which of course, it's always so interesting because we do a lot of work in financial services. And all that. And I do a lot of speaking. I just came back from Money 2020 in Vegas, doing the financial brand forum in the spring. And there's always in financial services, it's different. Or at least, if not that overt statement, there's the feeling of challenger equals risky. And I get that. I think it's the connotation of the word rather than the actual definition, because everybody's playing on the same surface. You know what I mean? You can't take what Liquid Death is doing and bring it to a community bank in Texas. But you can look at the fundamentals of what they're doing differently. Within their category, they look at everybody else and they say, it's all the same. How do I put something out that's different? And so you might be a little bit more restricted. Your box might be a little bit smaller creatively in the world of financial services. And you do have that, especially as an incumbent, the necessity, but also the competitive advantage of having trust that you don't want to dilute by, preaching too much about what's wrong with the system or coming across as too risky or as too much of a challenger to the status quo. But I do think that the same thing still applies.
Yeah. I must say, I mean, now that you mentioned that, I'm really not a big fan of the financial services challengers who are actually challenging the trust in our system. That worries me
Yeah.
terribly. And we're seeing quite a lot of it where actually, as they challenge a tactic, they are directly creating a sense of mistrust amongst our audiences for the institutions. And I don't think that's
Mm.
helpful, because we are actually very good institutions and very trustworthy, that's for sure. So that is a bit of a worry for me. Um, so I worked with Mike Abel for a very long time. He founded M&C Saatchi Abel here in South Africa. And he always used to say, the job in advertising is to make the familiar strange or make the strange familiar. And when you said liquid death, it's exactly what I thought of as, making the familiar strange has been their tactic. And maybe that's part of what we need to do in something like financial services, where arguably products are relatively commoditized, is how do you do it in a way? How do you
Yeah.
just talk about it in a way that makes it more interesting, or more human, rather than necessarily having to actually challenge at its core,
Mhm.
the basis of the institutions. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think people are open to that. I love that expression of making the familiar strange and the strange familiar. I think the other, it's maybe not an expression, but definitely a first principle for me is like, people spend time with good content. You know what I mean? Like, it doesn't matter if it comes from a friend in social media or a movie that's put out by a studio or a brand. It's just most advertising sucks. And there's the
Exactly.
reality
You
of
see it, you
that.
don't feel it.
You know, I
Exactly that. Yeah.
yeah, I mean, like, we both spent a lot
Yeah.
of time in agencies and working with brands. Like,
Mm.
and this is coming to the question that I want to ask you because I thought it was a really interesting perspective, having gone across the fence to the corporate side. But, it's not as simple as people on the sideline or people on the agency side can make it out to be or hope that it is. And so the question that I wanted to touch on is, you said there are, quote, challenges to being brave that agencies don't always see and understand. Can you unpack that for us?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, I suppose when I moved over into corporate, I thought, oh, yeah, it's going to be easy. I could just sign off on those brilliant big ideas and make them happen. And you realize it's not that simple. And also you realize that the real responsibility of holding the pen is a much heavier one than maybe you notice when you're in an agency side, because you've truly got to consider every aspect of your activity. And there's a lot to consider. I think possibly a little bit of advice to agencies is that the brave ideas that take in the context into account are amazing. The brave ideas that miss some of the context are really hard. So sometimes I feel that sometimes there can be a little bit of naivety in some of the kind of oversimplification of what can be done. And you need partners who deeply, deeply appreciate your context, so that they can see where the opportunities for bravery are and where maybe they aren't. Um, Having said that, I suppose that's the job, is to hold, to know the moments where you need to absolutely hold and defend the idea, and to know the moments where it's okay, to compromise. You can't fight for everything, but to be really clear on the things that you can't compromise. And that's what I need to balance and get right. And it's early days. But yeah, that kind of slightly, I do think there was a moment of naivety in the beginning. I was like, oh, it'll be all so easy and I'll do this amazing work. We'll get there, but it's gonna, it's not as simple as it seems, to really understand context, business context, commercial context, the broader picture.
Are there any tips you have of what you've done differently or would do differently with an agency partner now having this experience for 18 months on the other side?
Oh gosh. So something that was said to me that actually I was quite startled by, was, gosh, you marketing people, it's nice to hear someone who doesn't speak this marketing language and actually just makes sense. And I thought, wow, marketing, and you're a financial services person, and you use all these fancy financial terms. But I was really quite taken aback like that and by that, and a bit disappointed that our industry are seen as kind of having jargon and speaking in kind of slightly unclear or fluffy ways. So I think that would be, it's not maybe advice to agency, but advice to all of us to make sure that we are just keeping it simple, saying what we mean, not feeling we need to hide behind jargon and fluffy things around impressions and driving consideration and top of the funnel, and actually just say to our business stakeholders, to explain to them what we're truly trying to do in basic ways, like we're telling a story and this is the story we want to tell. So that was a massive wake up to me, that marketing was seen as being a jargonful industry when, here we've got a technology team and a legal team and so that was a bit of a wake up. And maybe that's on all of us. I also think, we constantly are challenged in our space to do better work. I suppose if you look at the big awards over the last few years in advertising, we've really, we've got to make sure we're doing truly brilliant work as an industry so that we can continue to claim the higher ground on what we do, work that drives the share price, really. So that's, I suppose, also another big challenge. But my first would be, can we just say what we mean?
Yeah,
Cut the jargon.
I totally agree. And I know we're running out of time. And if I got to half the questions that I wanted to ask you, I'd be surprised. But one that I definitely want to make sure we touch on, and I think what you just talked about is a great segue for it, is another quote that I pulled from our briefing call. You said that, quote, sometimes you just need hardworking work, which I totally agree with. Sometimes you just need to explain it like it is. Sometimes simplicity is the highest form of complexity. And sometimes, marketing just needs to kind of do its job. Like Tim, our chief creative officer, has this expression where he's just like, sometimes advertising does not need to be complicated. I'd love for you to talk about that for like a minute or two. Like, what does that mean to you when you say sometimes you just need hardworking work?
Yeah. I think it's this, I suppose, I spent the first whole part of this interview speaking about how we want to inject emotion and the power of creativity and don't, risk of boring. But on the antithesis of that is if we try and boil the ocean on every banner ad that we're doing for a lending product, we're never going to get any work out. And I think that, so it is about really knowing where to invest the energy and also knowing where you just need to cut through, have the right tone, have the right kind of brand, position in your work and write a good line, really, clear and simple or slightly clever line and get it out there and not overthink absolutely every execution. It does worry me when every brief is going in with, what is the audience insight and proposition, and actually we're just doing a money market account. You know what I mean? Like, let's just get that message. That's what I mean by hardworking. I think it's also about all of us knowing where we're going to put the energy to elevate real impact and creativity that creates those long-term brand memories and feelings and emotions, versus when do we just want this to tell people what we need them to know in a clear, simple, and relevant way to them. So there's that word again. But yeah. So I do. And again, I don't think we've got that right, but I think working with the teams, it's trying to make sure that we aren't putting the same amount of energy into everything. We're knowing the moments where that energy is required.
Yep. And is that, as things come up, are you just kind of feeling your way through it and saying, I feel like this is an opportunity to do something bigger, or actually this just needs to be hardworking, or is there any type of framework that you use to kind of help to,
I'm trying
prioritize your
to,
resources and time?
yeah. I suppose it's more at a principles level. I'm trying to get the teams to sustain work for a lot longer and to build on what has worked rather than reinvent everything. Again, there's lots of marketing science in support of that. So that's really, really useful. The kind of whole idea that wear out is actually not really a thing. The whole idea around creative consistency being an absolute amplifier of effectiveness. So really just trying to nail those principles and therefore, if we've been doing something, it's worked quite well, it's working, it's doing its job, stick to it, don't change it, just carry on going. This kind of desire for reinvention constantly, this, especially in retail, that anniversary mentality starts to bake in. So I suppose at a principle level, I'm trying to liberate the teams to feel comfortable, but if something works, you just stick to it. It doesn't make what what your role is less. You can then get that time back to focus. Produce less, spend more on media, sustain what
Have,
works,
it,
stick to your
have
knitting.
as much choice as well. There's definitely something to
Exactly,
that.
all of that.
All right, Diana. Well, I know we're out of time. Thank you so much for doing this. It was a great conversation. Before I let you go, just going to do a quick lightning round. So quick, kind of
Okay.
one-sentence answers
Gosh.
to the following 4 questions. The first is, what was the first marketing job you ever had?
I was an account executive at Ogilvy in Cape Town, working on Volkswagen.
What is the best piece of career advice you've received?
Do what's in front of you every day, and the rest will come.
What,
Don't worry about what's
what
around
is
the
the
corner.
what is the best brand campaign you've seen recently?
Ooh, no, you're challenging me. Everything Apple does is amazing. I think the Nike work is quite good at the moment, which is good to see.
And lastly, what is one thing people should do differently after listening to this episode?
Be really, really clear on what the story is that they want to tell.
All right, Diana. Thank you so much. Hope to see you in
Thank
January.
you, Eric. Awesome.
Scratch is a production of Rival. We are a growth consultancy that builds challenger brands, strategies, and capabilities to disrupt categories. If you want to learn more about us, check out wearerival.com. If you want to connect with me, email me at eric@wearerival.com or find me on LinkedIn. If you enjoyed today's show, please subscribe, share with anyone you think might enjoy it, and leave us a review. Thanks for listening, and see you next week.